Hi everyone, so you might have seen my last video with the nerfed GoD in GR 115 that I cleared in 106, but those were hours and minutes. So the God nerf has been very badly received overall, and I want to talk a little bit about this and put it in perspective, and maybe also give some suggestions of how to do it better. Because, well, GoD has really revived the class, I would say. It came in season 21 as part of the last sets that were released from the new sets, and everyone loved it. GoD has really filled the gap that the Demon Hunter needed to fill, and now everyone is in love with this set. It's really great for farming, for pushing. It's easy to play on like kind of the lower end. It's easy to get into, and it also has some really intricate, mechanical details that make it really interesting to push with as well. So it has both the low end and the higher potential. It's this, it incorporates this feeling of easy to learn, hard to master, and this is really the best thing about it. On top of that, it also brought back Demon Hunter as kind of like the top class in the game, or close to the top classes. So there has been Crusader with Heaven's Fury and Bomb, and there has been Necromancers all over the place, and there was also Wizard, for example, in season 22. But in general, Demon Hunter was really lacking some good endgame builds. Before that, for pushing, it was only rapid fire, which, well, everyone hates pretty much. And, well, it was really necessary to replace that. So that is great. Regardless, GoD has been performing extremely well, especially in situations where you were fishing a lot and where you didn't need to kill the boss yourself. So especially in season 21, GoD was extremely strong because, well, you didn't need to kill the boss, and also missile dampening fishing. So the thing is with missile dampening that, it's really fun to get one, because you shoot your arrows into the missile dampening slow bubble and it will keep piercing until everything is dead. It completely obliterates everything. You can have almost no DPS. You can go into a GR 150 and the arrows will eventually kill everything if you have a missile dampening. So obviously this is extremely strong, and it basically boosts the fishing potential by a few more tiers. I don't know exactly, but let's say between 2 and 5 tiers compared to what you would otherwise be able to do without missile dampening. And that makes it so that at the very high end you kind of have to go for it, and that makes pushing and fishing with this towards the top end extremely obnoxious. So it's good to address this. So the basic idea behind this change, limiting the amount of pierces that the arrow can do, is actually pretty good, because that would really help with this missile dampening fishing. It would be great to maybe be happy about finding a missile dampening still, so it improves your DPS slightly because you consistently get whatever cap they set. Because typically on a single target you have 2 piercers, on 2 targets you have like between 2 and 4, and then it scales up with the amount of targets. And typically in like a decent density pool of, let's say, 20 plus monsters, you probably get something like between 10 and 30 pierces most of the time. And the more pierces you have, the higher the potential goes, because not only do you hit more targets, but your damage per target also goes up because of the Devouring Arrow effect that gives you 70% extra damage every time. So obviously when you have the situation where you have an arrow that pierces like 50 times, 100 times, it will just eventually one-shot pretty much everything. And that is a little bit too much. And that also makes it so that the AoE potential of this build, which is funny enough is a single target arrow ability. This is like the most basic ability in the game. But at the same time, this is actually also the most AoE potential in the game pretty much, because of this extremely exponential damage scaling that this skill has through the infinite pierces and the extra damage per pierce. All this leads to the single target damage of the build being extremely terrible. So I have shown this back in season 21 after I cleared my GR 150 solo. I was pushing without a Bane of the Stricken, and then I did one run for science, just equipping Bane of the Stricken, and it took me 8.5 minutes to kill the Rift Guardian. And this was a single target Rift Guardian. This was not a bad Rift Guardian. This was basically something that you would like to get. So because of this extremely high AoE potential that the build has, and then you have the crazy conduits that you can get, and now in the future we also have Nemesis Pylons, so it's quite easy to get one-floor rifts, or close to one-floor rifts, where God Demon Hunter excels really well because of the mobility, because of the AoE damage, and then you just reach the boss with like 7 minutes left and you can't kill it. So this is something that we had in the early seasons before Bane of the Stricken existed, but now we have this build and it really has the same issue even with Banner's trick, and it gives you, times 10 damage or something on a long Rift Guardian fight. So naturally, limiting the amount of pierces that the God Demon Hunter can do is actually a pretty good choice, because that would also, while nerfing the build overall, improve the single target damage in comparison to the AoE damage. So this is a little bit similar to what happened to the Witch Doctor in the past when they nerfed the Mask of Jerem interaction with the Phantasms. They nerfed the AoE damage and kept Mani 2 the same, and this improved the single target damage compared to the AoE damage while nerfing the build, because he simply went lower tiers, your AoE potential went down, but the single target was staying the same. And now you can actually kill a boss in not outrageous amount of time, because Witch Doctor suffered from the same issue. So when playing the new GoD on the PTR, I actually noticed that quite well, that suddenly I was able to kill bosses so fast, because, well, you have 2 pierces maximum, and on single target you basically get 2 pierces anyway, and in AoE situations instead of 20 pierces I also get 2. So naturally I go so much lower and the boss will just die really fast, and that feels amazing. It's great to kill the boss really fast. And also just to be able to maybe finish an elite. Usually when you push and you have like a really high AoE damage build, you have these elites that survive with like 10% HP, and you can't kill them. You have to skip them, because it would be a time loss to try to finish them with the last 10%, because without any like extra trash monsters or whatever, you don't have the area damage, you don't really scale well enough, and you just lose time. And this is exactly one of these issues that God suffers in the live service. Now, with all this said, GoD has seen a really heavy nerf with this new patch. So there is a way to go around the nerf a little bit right now on the PTR, and that is by changing the rune from Devouring Arrow to Shatter Shot. So what happens here is that those 2 extra arrows that you get after piercing, and you get them every time because you have a guaranteed pierce, they will actually not be affected by this cap of 2 pierces only. So this essentially gives you back the old effect without this crazy exponential scaling from Devouring Arrow, and it still gives you the missile dampening fishing effect. So essentially this fix that they tried to make with reducing concerns for missile dampening is completely pointless, because everyone will just play Shatter Shot. This is actually a stronger rune now than the Devouring Arrow. It's better by roughly 5 tiers or so, because Devouring Arrow just got like a huge nerf. Devouring Arrow is probably something like minus 15 or 20 tiers, so it's really bad. You don't notice it too much when you're speed farming, because in speed farming you generally don't have these really large pulls, but when you're pushing you can definitely feel that it's very hard to kill anything. You make like a large pull and you can't even hit anything in that pull, because the arrow basically just flies into a brick wall of 2 monsters and then disappears. So we can't even hit the center of the pull to get any arrow damage procs or anything. You just like slowly kind of like shoot into this wall of monsters until the first target dies and the second target, and then you just like kind of eat through the pull. So this is really bad. Then Shattershot basically plays exactly the same as before, and overall I would guess that this is something like 8 tiers weaker or so than the current live version of the Devouring Arrow build. And you still have the fishing for missile dampening, you still have the fishing for density, all the same. And I think actually single target damage is probably even worse than before, because you don't even get those 2 extra pierces or something with the extra damage here. I don't think that the extra arrows can actually hit the same target. So this means that the single target performance is even worse than before. The thing is that Shatter Shot is actually decent enough to farm with. So you can play this in T16, it's pretty decent, especially once you have a little bit more damage, but even on the low end, I tried this on the PTR, I was blasting through T16, no problem, so that still works. I was also doing some speed runs like GR 100 or so, that also still works, but it's obviously not really top tier anymore. In either case, it's extremely paradoxical to have this limit on the amount of pierces and then not have the Shatter Shot arrows affected by it. So this might be an oversight, and this will probably also be fixed so that those extra arrows here also don't get the infinite amount of pierces, and well, that makes sense. But anyway, if that happens without changing this nerf, we will be in a really bad spot here. So this Shatter Shot rune will be dead as well. We're gonna play Devouring Arrow, and it's gonna be something like 15 to 20 tiers worse than before for pushing. And it will feel really bad, aside from finishing off those elites and the Rift Guardian. So long story short, the limit of 2 pierces doesn't make any sense. It's way too low. And I was suggesting a limit on pierces in the past, actually, before they even thought about nerfing it, because I was actually concerned about missile dampening, and I was also concerned about, how bad the single target damage is and how bad it feels to try to kill bosses and elites with this. So I think maybe slightly reducing the performance of the build was definitely in order, but I was thinking about something like 2 or 3 tiers by limiting the cap to something like 20 pierces, for example. This would completely or almost completely remove the missile dampening interactions. You would still do slightly more damage most likely, especially when there's not much around this missile dampening elite, because, well, 20 pierces are still quite a lot. This is something that you get in like a decently sized pool usually. So still high damage, but nothing super crazy where you just like melt everything in seconds. Such a limit would have reduced the need for fishing with missile dampening while essentially leaving pretty much any other activity completely unaffected. Most people would never even notice that cap because, well, unless you're fishing and pushing for really high tiers, you would usually not get those 20 pierces to begin with. So for farming, for speedruns, and even for most people trying to push, they would barely notice this cap. They would probably not even go 1 tier lower with like a cap of, for example, 20 pierces. I think even something like 10 pierces would be kind of reasonable if they want to bring down GoD a little bit while still keeping the farming efficiency rather unchanged. Because again, even 10 pierces is kind of hard to get, but yeah, you probably would notice it a little bit by, maybe 2 or 3 tiers or something for like GR speed farming. And then also for most people's pushers, they would go slightly lower, but that would still leave Demon Hunter as probably an S tier class, as an S tier build. And again, the pushing would be not that much affected for most people, I believe, and as long as you're not fishing for some really crazy rifts. On the other hand, something like a 10 PS cap would already help tremendously with the single target potential for the high-end pushers, and you probably wouldn't have to do 8-minute boss fights anymore, maybe just 5 minutes, which is still horrible, but it's an improvement. Now, there would be some other potential fixes for this problem. For example, someone suggested to me that they could just, instead of limiting the pierces, limit the lifespan of the arrow, so that after X seconds it will simply despawn, and that will essentially completely kill the missile dampening interactions. And you can just set that number or that lifespan to be precisely the same time that it takes for the arrow to travel 120 yards, because this is the maximum travel distance of the arrow right now. So I don't know exactly, this is something like 2 seconds or 3 seconds, and that's about it. So that would fix missile dampening while leaving virtually everything else unaffected, and would solve the issue entirely without nerfing the build. Funny enough, missile dampening would actually become a really bad affix in that case, because most likely most arrows would actually just get stuck mid-air and not ever hit anything. So missile dampening would go from like completely OP to really bad. So this is maybe another concern. So perhaps the lifespan could be set to something like slightly higher than this travel distance would usually take. And that could maybe help out with that a little bit. And then you can like strafe around basically inside the enemies, shoot your arrows, and like this might work out pretty well. Now, the last thing really bad about this nerf is also the fact that it only counts for the GoD DH, and it doesn't count for any of the other stats. And well, it turns out that Hanging Arrow is actually the best build for 5 out of 6 Demon Hunter leaderboards that we're gonna have next season. So that's gonna be all the 5 sets, and that's gonna be a no stat leaderboard. And for LON and LOD, it is quite close with rapid fire, so we'll see. But for all the other sets, it's essentially Hanging Arrow or nothing. So that is really the big issue here, that the other sets actually are not affected by this limit to the pierces at all. It's only with the GoD DH for some reason. So instead of nerfing the quiver, they actually just nerfed the GoD set for whatever reason. And that is extremely bad in my opinion. The currently best build for Demon Hunter is actually UE Hanging Arrow. If you want to fish a lot, it is slightly behind the live server GoD DH, and it will most likely be ahead of the nerfed GoD DH in the current version, because you can still play UE Hanging Arrow with Devouring Arrow. You can still get infinite pierces, you can still get missile dampening. It's all the same, you just have to basically play it more manual, and it's going to be more squishy and less mobile, but overall the damage potential is extremely close to the GoD DH, and it will probably also have better single target damage. So for the high-end fishing, this is definitely the way to go right now. And we were totally expecting this to be the best UE build. And even with a quite heavy nerf to the quiver, or the amount of pierces or whatever that would also affect Unhurled Essence, we would probably still not play multi-shot. Similarly, we have the Marauder set, which also has a multiplier for Hanging Arrow. And again, we would play Marauder Hanging Arrow with Devouring Arrow. and there's no cap on the pierces, there is still mesometametic fishing, etc, etc. You wouldn't play Cluster Arrow here, you would play Hanging Arrow. And even with Natalia, I don't have a piece here right now, but there you can do an N6 God 4 combo, which I've actually played a lot in Torment 16 back in Season 21. And that would actually be the best Natalia build right now. Even on the nerfed version, you'd probably still play this over Natalia Rapid Fire or over N6 M4. So in the case of Natalia set, it is actually quite close. So there is quite some competition between especially N6 M4 and this N6 God 4 combo. But overall, it would most likely end up to be Hanging Arrow anyway, because again, the fishing potential is extremely high. And you can always get those Mr. Dampeners, you can always, go crazy. And again, for Legacy of Dreams, it's also Hanging Arrow or Rapid Fire, probably with Hanging Arrow winning. So now what I would actually suggest as probably the best fix you can do is to nerf this quiver and give it a cap of pierces, let's say something like 10, and then buff the God DH to make up for it. So even though the overall impact of the nerf is not that large for most people, because you're mostly farming, for example, and not really pushing that high, it still feels really bad because suddenly your mini tier is weaker. And even though GoD is actually still the strongest build or close to the strongest, if you also include UE Hanging Arrow there, it just has a very big psychological impact for people that came back because of this. They really love to play this build, they're really hyped to play this in the next season, and suddenly they're much weaker than before, and it just feels really bad. And on top of that, the fix doesn't really solve the issue to begin with. I believe that especially now with those new set leaderboards, we should have a focus on the distinct individual playstyles of those sets and kind of give them enough support to actually have the best build, the meta build for this set, be kind of like its own version or its own playstyle. So I want to have Cluster Bombs on Marauder, or I want to have Multi-Shot on Unhallowed Essence, or even Ball Lightning on Unhallowed Essence, or I want to have the Rain of Vengeance or Fan of Knives, or even N6 and 4 on Natalia. And having Hanging Arrow on all of those leaderboards is kind of messy and doesn't really feel great. So potentially a better fix is to actually limit the quiver even more. So let's say something like 5 or 10 pierces, so anywhere in that range. The lower you go, obviously, the better the single target will feel, but the worse the AoE will feel. So 5 might be a little too low because, again, you have kind of this issue, you have a big pull, you shoot in there, you hit nothing. But it would be fine if the damage would be increased of God DH as well. So they could compensate by actually buffing the God set and limiting the quiver. So this would kind of shift the AoE potential towards the single target potential. It would limit the effect of Hanging Arrow for other builds, for Marauder, UE, LOD, Natalia, and it would keep the God DH kind of on the same level depending on the numbers that you choose. So for example, when you limit this to 10 pierces, I would say God DH could be buffed to 15,000%, for example, instead of 10,000. And if you limit it to 5 pierces, then you can make it maybe 20,000%. And that would give it, it's kind of a really strong generator focus that the set has to begin with. And the really good part about this is it would also buff other generator builds that you can do with God DH, especially bolas. Bolas are kind of weak, and there's not really a reason to play bolas because, well, Hanging Arrow exists and Hanging Arrow is just better in every way. And nerfing the quiver with the limited amount of pierces would solve all of these issues at once. So after a lot of thought and a lot of testing and discussion, this is my final suggestion. Something between 5 to 10 pierces if they really want to reduce the fishing potential and improve the single target damage as well, and then buff the set, the 6-piece especially, by an amount of something like plus 50 to 100%. And I think that would kind of even out depending on which numbers you choose exactly. It's very hard to calculate these things because of the Hanging Arrow behavior and the amount of pierces being really different in many pools. So it's really hard to say how this will perform before such a change. So we'd have to test this to kind of get a feel for it. But just from my experience, I have played this build for hundreds of hours. I would believe that these are reasonable values to keep the overall performance of the set the same, potentially even increase it slightly for something like speed farming content where you usually don't get a lot of pierces. So it would kind of like be on the top end of like solo speed farming builds especially. It could potentially come back as a speed meta for 4-man. A lot of people also really enjoyed the 4-man God speeds that we had in season 21 when the set came out. And a lot of people actually played God in 4-man quite a lot, even though rats were kind of like pulling ahead slightly later on. And well, in season 22, everyone went back to rats. Right now, the God set, even without the nerf, would have no chance to compete with rats. And I think such a change could also help out to actually kind of like bring another option to 4-man XP runs as well. And that is one that is really beloved by a lot of people, a lot of the Demon Hunter mains. And well, it's just something else, and it's not rats. So this is also another perk that such a change would have. So I know this has been a quite long video, but I really wanted to give my full expertise and my full input with all the thoughts that went into it. And I hope that I could make it clear for every one of you. And I would really like to know what you're thinking about my suggestions, about my thoughts, about any kind of concerns that I might not have noticed or might not have mentioned. I believe that we're not really aware of what such a change would do, both to the build and also to the community. So something has to change, that's pretty clear. And I hope that Blizzard will listen and make a reasonable choice. I explored some options here, so there could be some easy fixes, there could be some more intricate fixes that would, depending on how exactly you address this, solve some more issues that the Hanging Arrow creates. And well, let's see what happens. I'm quite optimistic that Blizzard is aware of the feedback and they will do something about it, and in the end we are going to be quite happy with the result. So this is what I wanted to share here. Let me know what you think, or maybe you have some other suggestions, and see you guys next time.